You're standing in the hallway on a Sunday afternoon, running your thumb over a series of small pencil lines on the doorframe between the kitchen and the living room, each one dated in your own handwriting, going back 20 years. The afternoon light comes through the same window it always has, at the same slight angle, catching dust in the air the way it does every clear Sunday around this time. The lowest mark says your daughter's name and an age that feels like it belongs to someone else's life. The highest mark, added 3 months ago, says she's taller than you now, a fact that still catches you off guard every time you actually stand next to her. You bought this house at 29, a modest 3-bedroom in a neighborhood nobody would call impressive, with a mortgage payment that felt enormous at the time, and a kitchen you swore, back then, you'd renovate within 5 years. You never renovated it. You're still standing in that same kitchen now, 20 years later, the same laminate counters, the same slightly crooked cabinet door you've meant to fix since roughly year 3, the same specific creak in the floor by the sink that you've long since stopped noticing except when a guest points it out. Here's what almost nobody tells you about staying in one house for 2 decades, the part that never makes it into the real estate commercials about moving up. The house doesn't just sit there while your life happens around it. It quietly does something to you, to your finances, to your sense of who you are, to a specific kind of stability you don't notice building until you're standing in a hallway one Sunday afternoon, running your thumb over 20 years of pencil marks you almost forgot were there. You signed the papers at 29 with a 30-year fixed mortgage at $1,340 a month, a number that consumed close to a third of your take-home pay at the time and felt, for the first several years, like a weight you'd be carrying indefinitely. You remember specifically the anxiety of the first winter, a furnace repair bill of $890 landing the same month as a slower quarter at work, doing the math at the kitchen table with the same crooked cabinet door in view, wondering if you'd overextended yourselves buying this particular house at all. Your spouse mentioned more than once that first year whether you'd made a mistake taking on a payment that size on the income you had at the time. You didn't refinance for the sake of a lower rate chasing every market dip, the way a coworker once suggested you should, mentioning she'd refinanced 3 times in 5 years, trying to shave fractions of a % off her rate. You refinanced exactly once, in year 7, when rates dropped meaningfully enough to justify the closing costs, shaving your payment down to $1,190 a month, and knocking 3 years off the remaining term. Beyond that single, carefully considered move, you just kept paying the same mortgage, month after month, through raises and slow years alike, occasionally throwing an extra $200 at the principal during a good bonus season, mostly out of habit, rather than any dramatic strategy. There were years it genuinely didn't feel like progress. Year 11 was a particularly lean stretch, a slow period at work that froze raises for 18 months. And you remember specifically wondering, checking the mortgage balance out of habit, one night, whether the whole thing was actually moving anywhere at all. It was. It just moved the way these things always do, invisibly in the background, indifferent to how discouraged you happen to feel about it in any given month. The mortgage balance crossed 0 11 months ago, on an entirely unremarkable Tuesday. You'd known it was coming for over a year, watched the final balance shrink on the amortization schedule the way you'd watch anything slow and expected, and still felt something catch in your chest the day the final payment cleared, and the statement read $0 for the first time in 20 years. You didn't celebrate loudly. You made a slightly nicer dinner than usual and told your daughter, who didn't fully grasp what it meant, but seemed happy that you were happy. Your spouse mentioned that same night something you hadn't thought about in years, the specific fear you'd both carried during that first winter, wondering if the $1,340 payment had been a mistake, and how strange it felt now to realize the entire 2-decade arc had ended in exactly the opposite direction from that early anxiety. Neither of you had any way of knowing, sitting at that same kitchen table 20 years earlier, that the number that felt so frightening then would eventually become a number you'd simply stop having to think about at all. Currently, the median homeowner who bought at your same starting point and stayed the full mortgage term saves well over $180,000 in interest compared to someone who refinances into a new 30-year loan every 5 to 7 years chasing marginally better rates or a bigger house. Not because refinancing is always wrong, but because resetting the clock repeatedly resets the interest math right along with it, every single time. Your friend Colleen bought her first house the same year you bought yours, a starter home 2 towns over, and has moved 3 times since, once for a bigger yard when her second kid was born, once for a better school district, once for a kitchen she'd always wanted with an island, and the counters you'd once sworn you'd install yourself. Each move felt, at the time, like obvious progress. Each one also meant a new 30-year mortgage, resetting the amortization clock back to its earliest, most interest-heavy years, plus closing costs, realtor commissions, and moving expenses that quietly ate into whatever equity she'd built in the previous house. You remember visiting her second house, genuinely impressed by the school district and the space, and asking, out of real curiosity rather than judgment, how the numbers had worked out across all 3 moves. She wasn't entirely sure herself, which struck you as telling in its own way, not because she was careless, but because the accounting across 3 separate transactions, 3 separate mortgages, 3 separate sets of closing costs, is genuinely hard to track without sitting down and doing the actual math, which most people moving for a bigger yard or a better school district simply don't have the bandwidth to do in the middle of an already stressful transition. You ran the numbers with her once, at a birthday dinner a few years back, mostly out of curiosity rather than any intention to make her feel behind. Colleen's current home is worth more than yours on paper, a genuinely nicer house in a genuinely nicer neighborhood. But between 3 sets of closing costs, 3 restarted mortgages, and the specific way each move reset her principal paydown back towards 0, her actual home equity sits meaningfully lower than yours, despite a higher purchase price and 18 more years of total mortgage payments made across her various homes combined. She went quiet for a moment when you walked through the math together, not upset exactly, just recalibrating something she'd never actually sat down and calculated before. Colleen isn't bad with money. She's smart, careful, thoughtful about most of her decisions. She was just running a different equation than you were, chasing a version of progress that looked, from the outside, exactly like what moving up is supposed to look like. There's a specific cultural pressure behind that equation that's easy to underestimate, the sense, reinforced by almost everything around her, that staying in a starter home for 2 decades signals stagnation rather than strategy, while moving toward a bigger house every few years signals a life that's clearly working. Currently, the average American homeowner moves roughly 11 times across their adult life, and each move carries transaction costs, commissions, closing fees, moving expenses, that typically run 8 to 10% of the home's value, a cost that never shows up on any single moving day's invoice, but quietly compounds against you every single time you restart the process somewhere new. Colleen's 3 moves, run through that same rough math, likely cost her somewhere in the neighborhood of $95,000 in transaction costs alone across the last 2 decades. Money that, had it simply stayed invested in one continuously appreciating, continuously paid down property, would have added meaningfully to the equity gap you noticed at that birthday dinner. There's a specific kind of competence that builds only through staying somewhere long enough to actually learn it, and you didn't understand that until around year 12, standing in the crawl space at 10 p.m., with a flashlight in your teeth, fixing a leaking pipe joint you recognized on site because you'd fixed the exact same joint's neighbor 5 years earlier. You know which floorboard in the hallway creaks and which one doesn't. You know the furnace's specific rattle that means nothing, and the different one that means call someone. You know exactly how much sun the back bedroom gets in July, which window needs weather stripping before the first real cold snap, which gutter clogs first when the maple out front finally drops its leaves. None of that knowledge transfers to a new house. Colleen mentioned once, tired, that she'd spent her first 6 months in the newest place calling contractors for problems you'd have solved yourself in 20 minutes, simply because she hadn't lived with that particular furnace, that particular roofline long enough to develop the instinct for what was actually wrong versus what merely sounded alarming. She estimated, half joking, that she'd probably paid for at least a dozen service calls over the years that amounted to nothing more than a house doing something normal that she simply didn't yet recognize as normal. You've saved, by rough estimate over the years, several $1,000s in service calls purely by knowing your own house well enough to diagnose most of its moods yourself. There's a psychological version of this too, harder to put a number on. Your daughter has had exactly one bedroom her entire life, one set of walls that have watched an entire childhood happen inside them. The same paint color she picked at age 6 and still hasn't wanted changed. The same window she used to watch for the school bus from, now the same window she does her homework beside most evenings. Your spouse mentioned once, during a rough patch a few years back, that simply walking into this specific kitchen at the end of a hard day did something to their nervous system that no other kitchen ever could. A kind of grounding that had nothing to do with the house's actual size or finish quality, and everything to do with 20 years of ordinary life having happened inside it. You've noticed the same effect in yourself in smaller, less dramatic moments. Coming home from a difficult work trip and feeling something in your shoulders release the second you turn onto your own street, well before you've even pulled into the driveway. It's not the house itself doing that. It's 20 years of the house being the place where difficult days reliably end, which turns out to be its own kind of quiet infrastructure, built the same slow way the mortgage paid itself down. Mr. Alvarez next door moved in the same year you did, and you've watched each other's lives unfold across 2 decades of shared driveways and borrowed ladders. He watched your daughter learn to ride a bike on this street. You watched his own kids leave for college, one by one, and watched him and his wife slowly become the retired couple who waters everyone's plants during vacations. When your furnace died unexpectedly one January, he was the one who lent you a space heater at 11 p.m. Without a second thought, the kind of favor that only exists between people who've had 20 years to build the specific trust that makes lending a stranger a space heater feel completely unremarkable. There have been dozens of smaller versions of the same thing over the years. Mr. Alvarez watching your house during a 2-week vacation without being asked twice. You doing the same for him during his wife's surgery recovery. An unspoken rotation of favors that neither of you tracks or keeps score of because 2 decades of proximity have made the accounting unnecessary. You know his grandkids' names. He remembers your daughter's birthday most years before you do. None of that happens quickly, and none of it survives a move intact, no matter how friendly you are with the people who eventually replace you on a given street. You've thought, more than once, about what it would actually take to rebuild a relationship like the one you have with Mr. Alvarez somewhere new, and the honest answer is that it can't really be rebuilt on any accelerated timeline. It requires the specific, unglamorous accumulation of small favors and shared ordinary days that only time can generate. The same way the mortgage only paid itself off through 20 years of unremarkable monthly payments rather than any single dramatic gesture. Colleen, by comparison, mentioned once that she still doesn't know most of her current neighbors' last names, 3 years into her newest house, not from any lack of effort on her part, just from the specific math of community building resetting every time she moves. It takes years to become the kind of neighbor someone calls first in an emergency, and every relocation, however upgraded the house itself, sends you back to the beginning of that particular clock. She mentioned, almost wistfully, that her old neighborhood, the one from her second house, sold 5 years ago, was finally starting to feel like that kind of place right around the time she moved again for the school district. Currently, researchers who study long-term neighborhood residency consistently find that people who stay in one community for over a decade report meaningfully higher levels of social trust and available support than people who relocate frequently. Even when controlling for income and education, it's not that people who move can't build community. It's that community, like a mortgage's amortization schedule, front-loads its slowest, least rewarding years right at the start, every single time you restart it somewhere new. Your cousin Derek, a realtor who sold houses in your area for 15 years, brings up selling almost every time you see him at a family gathering, always with the same well-meaning enthusiasm. You could get a genuinely large number for this house now, he says, easily enough for a serious down payment on something twice the size in a nicer part of town. He's not wrong about the number. Your home, purchased for $186,000 2 decades ago, is conservatively worth $540,000 today, and with the mortgage paid off entirely, that entire figure now sits as equity. A number that quietly makes up a meaningful share of your total net worth without you ever having actively invested a single additional dollar into it beyond the original mortgage payments themselves. Derek means well, and you understand why the pitch appeals to him professionally as much as personally. He's watched you build the kind of equity that, in his line of work, usually gets converted into a bigger commission and a bigger house, rather than simply left alone. You've thought about Derek's pitch seriously exactly twice over the years, running real numbers both times with your spouse at the same kitchen table where you once worried about that $890 furnace bill. Both times, the math came out the same way. A bigger house in a nicer neighborhood would mean a new mortgage, higher property taxes, higher insurance, higher heating and cooling costs for the extra square footage, and closing costs on both ends of the transaction. A combination that would meaningfully reduce your actual monthly financial freedom in exchange for square footage and a kitchen island. Neither of you have ever seriously wanted badly enough to justify the trade. The second time you ran the numbers, about 3 years ago, you actually toured 2 houses Derek had lined up, mostly out of curiosity more than genuine intent. Both were genuinely lovely. Both also came with property tax bills nearly double what you currently pay, a detail Derek mentioned almost in passing, the way agents sometimes do with numbers that complicate an otherwise appealing pitch. You did the actual math that same week and realized the upgrade would have cost you close to $1,100 more a month in total housing expenses against a mortgage you'd already paid off entirely. Derek took the no in stride, the way he always does, and mentioned the same pitch again 8 months later at your daughter's birthday party, equally well-meaning both times. Last year, you did open a small home equity line of credit, not to fund a lifestyle upgrade, but as a deliberate low-cost safety net sitting quietly unused in the background. The same kind of boring, protective decision that's defined most of the last 20 years. You've never drawn on it. It exists purely as optionality, a specific kind of quiet financial freedom that Colleen, 3 mortgages and 18 years of restarted equity later, doesn't currently have available to her in anywhere near the same proportion, despite her home's higher sticker price. You mentioned the HELOC to Derek once, half expecting him to see it as a step toward finally taking his advice. He didn't push. To his credit, he just nodded and said it made sense, the same way most of his genuinely good advice tends to get delivered alongside the pitches you don't take. You've come to appreciate that about him over the years. Even as you've turned down the bigger recommendation twice, he's never once made the no feel like a rejection of him personally, which is its own small, unremarkable kindness, built the same slow way as everything else in the story. 7 years ago, you were offered a genuinely excellent job. 2 states away, a 22% raise, a title you'd been working toward for a decade, at a company you deeply respected. You and your spouse spent 6 weeks seriously considering it, visiting the new city twice, even touring a handful of houses there with a local agent, running every version of the math you could think of. The job itself was the easy part of the decision. The house, strangely, turned out to be the hard part. You remember sitting in a rental car outside a genuinely lovely house in the new city, one with the kitchen island you'd always half-joked about wanting, and feeling something you hadn't expected, not excitement, but a specific, quiet grief for a version of your daughter's childhood that would end here. Mid-story, replaced by a new house with no pencil marks on any doorframe at all. Your spouse said something in that parking lot you've never forgotten, that the house itself was beautiful, but it was still just a house, whereas the one you already had was something closer to a character in your family's actual story. And characters don't get replaced mid-book without the reader noticing something's missing. You spent the drive back to the hotel that evening, running the numbers properly, the same way you'd run Derek's pitch years later. The 22% raise against the cost of a new mortgage at a much higher starting balance in a market with steeper home prices. The property tax increase, the fact that your current mortgage would be entirely paid off within 3 more years if you stayed, versus restarting the entire clock at nearly double the loan size in the new city. The raise looked substantial on paper. Once you accounted for the new housing costs and the lost equity position, the actual financial upgrade shrank down to something far more marginal than the headline number suggested. You turned the job down, not because the raise wasn't real or the opportunity wasn't genuine, but because you ran the actual math on what 20 years of paid-off equity, established community, and a house that already fit your entire life was actually worth against a 22% salary increase and a fresh mortgage clock in an unfamiliar city. Your old boss, when you declined, asked if you were sure, gently pointing out that opportunities like this one don't come around often. You told her the truth. You were sure, though it took you and your spouse most of those 6 weeks to actually arrive at it. You've never regretted the decision, though you still think, every so often, about that kitchen island in the rental car parking lot, and the specific deliberate choice it took to want your actual life more than a nicer version of it somewhere else. You're still standing in the hallway, thumb still resting on the lowest pencil mark, your daughter's name and an age that belongs to someone else's life now. The mortgage is gone. The crooked cabinet door is still crooked, and you've decided, somewhere along the way, that you actually like it slightly crooked, a small, specific flaw that's become part of what makes this kitchen yours, rather than any kitchen. Colleen's newest house is genuinely beautiful, and you mean that without any bitterness at all. She's happy there, and happiness was never the thing this comparison was about. She called last week, mentioning that her oldest is starting to ask why they keep moving, a question she didn't have a fully satisfying answer for beyond, for something better, which struck both of you, in the conversation that followed, as a strange thing to explain to a kid who'd simply wanted to keep the same bedroom a little longer. What's different between your life and hers is quieter than a nicer kitchen or a fancier zip code. It's a paid-off mortgage sitting as pure equity instead of a fourth restarted amortization schedule. It's a neighbor who'd lend you a space heater at 11 p.m. without a second thought, built from 20 years of proximity that no amount of charm can shortcut. It's Derek's pitch, considered honestly twice and declined twice, because the math never actually favored the upgrade once you accounted for everything a move would cost beyond the sale price itself. It's a daughter who had exactly one set of walls to grow up inside, and a doorframe that quietly kept score the whole time. 20 years of ordinary Tuesdays adding up into something neither of you ever had to chase, because you'd simply decided 20 years ago to stay. You add one more pencil mark to the doorframe before you leave the hallway. Not for your daughter this time, just a small dash and today's date, mostly out of habit, mostly because 20 years of marking this specific doorframe has become its own kind of quiet ritual you're not ready to stop. Somewhere down the street, Mr. Alvarez is out watering something in his front yard, and he waves the way he always does, the way only 20 years of the exact same street can make a simple wave feel entirely unremarkable and entirely valuable at the same time. What would it look like to measure your own next 20 years, not by how many times you move up, but by how deep you're willing to let any single place actually root?